And for the second part of the What Really Happened at Mount Sinai with Sheldon Enger. And Sheldon, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Okay, thank you, Judy. So, as fate would have it, this past weekend, my wife called my attention to the fact that on Channel 4, they were going to do a rerun of the 1956 version of 10 Commandments with Charlton Heston. And it was as bewildering then, the last Saturday, as it was when I probably saw it 50 some odd years ago, in terms of really not being the story. So what did really happen at Mount Sinai? Last week, we dissected the story as is. We went through it and I pointed out a great number of inconsistencies. The story is inconsistent where the revelation occurred. Was it on a mountaintop? Was it inside a cloud? Did it occur inside the tabernacle? And it says all three things within the same text, the same book, within the book of Exodus. Who wrote the words? Was it God or was it Moses? And we see both citations in different places within the text. What did the people experience? Was it sound only or was it visual? It says both things. When did Moses receive the Decalogue, the 10 Commandments? Was it on his first ascent, where he got words only? Or was it in the clouds when he was with God? Or was it in the tabernacle? Or was it on the mountaintop? There's citations for all four things. When did Moses communicate the commandments and the laws? Was it after the first descent, or was it not until he arrived in Canaan after 40 years? Which is it? And there are citations for both. So how do we explain it? Next slide, Judy. So not only how do we explain it, why should we be talking about this now? And we're about to talk about Passover. We're talking about freedom. We're talking about freedom from slavery. And I think why the biblical authors put the story together is they recognized that freedom, which is what the Exodus story is all about, without a basis for law, without some common understanding of how society should work equitably for all people concerned, without morality, it would be a different kind of chaos. Would be recreating Egypt all over again. So understanding what the linkage of the commandments are critical. And in fact, the biblical text tells us in the book of Exodus, every time God or Moses says, let my people go free, let my people go, it's always followed by the statement, so that they may worship with me. So it's not just freedom that we're talking about in terms of when we talk about Passover, but it's also freedom within a sense of morality. Next slide, please. So I talked about this story being inconsistent, and it's also discontinuous. So why were the laws given in stages? Why do the laws given in separate stages duplicate, in some cases, or contradict one another? These and similar questions have plagued readers for centuries. Modern biblical scholars have given us the answers. Let me share a story with you that occurred in the year 2012. My wife and I were in Israel with my daughter, and we went to Israel. primarily because I wanted to see some um, um, areas that are important in First Temple Judaism, the first century. I'm sorry, during the first century of the Common Era. Rochelle and I had been to Israel at least three times before that on group tours. But some of the things that are really important in terms of the first century, in terms of the transition that occurred during the Roman Empire, and then the breakaway in terms of Christianity, aren't on typical tour or the tours. So we scheduled a private guide, and then we had this private guide with us for 10 days of this 2-week trip. And it turned out to be an incredible investment because he had his master's degree in archaeology, and he was working on his PhD at that time in Judaism. So he really knew the Bible, he knew the sites, but more importantly, what he shared with me, what was going on in Israel at that time. He was at Hebrew University in Jerusalem, was a whole study project, a research project in terms of what was going on, determining who wrote the text and what did they write, what parts of the text did they write, and what was the meaning of the text at the time they wrote it. So he made me aware of that. He suggested a book that I should read, and ever since then, he's been sending me papers now in terms of electronically, in terms of what biblical scholars are coming up with. So this work is being done not only at Hebrew University in Jerusalem, it's also being done at Bar Ilan University in Israel. It's being done at Harvard Divinity School. There is a lot going on, and we know a lot more about in terms of the biblical text, what it was meant at the time it was written, and who wrote it. And so I'm going to share some of that information with you very shortly. So we'll have a better understanding of why there's 3 codes in the biblical text. 3 different codes, 3 different stories within the story of the Exodus. Explain why the text says so in places the laws were given on the mountain and conveyed immediately, or why the laws were given on the mountaintop but not conveyed until 40 years, or why the laws were conveyed in a tabernacle over 40 years, and how the people experienced that. We have a much better information now. So the text from Exodus 19 through 24 contains numerous repetitions as well as contradictions. Take, for example, Exodus 19:3 tells us that God was on the mountaintop several days before God gave the Torah to Moses. But Exodus 19:11 and 19:18 tells us that God descended onto the mountain just before the law giving occurred. Exodus 24 tells us clearly that God was in heaven. He was not on Mount Sinai when the laws were communicated. So where was it that Moses met with God? Biblical scholars have detected 4 different strands in the story, and 3 completely different messages. They're different, but there are also some things that they share in common. So we can read one single version of the story and get a complete picture, and the problems will with the storyline go away. Okay. Next slide, please. Why the inconsistencies in the text? The differences in perceptions of what happened at Sinai grew during centuries of oral transmission. As I talked about last week, we can pretty well document through Egyptian papyruses that the Exodus took place in the year 1198 BCE, that it only included one of the known tribes of Israel, the Levites, perhaps at most a second tribe. The majority of the scholars believe it was only one tribe, for reasons we explained last week. Yet the four sources also agree on something very crucial. So when we're talking about in terms of, we'll tell the story in terms of what each of the scribes indicated occurred, you'll see the differences pretty clearly. But I want you to think about what is the commonality that each agree on. And so the stories evolved over a period of time orally. So if the Exodus took place at 1198, we see there was an extended period of oral tradition. There was nothing in writing. As a matter of fact, Hebrew was just starting up at that point in time. The language, to the extent that there was a written language in that part of the world, it was Ugaritic, from which Judaism was the Jewish language, Hebrew was derived. So you see, the oral tradition took place at least to the year 1000, where if you follow the barcode, the first writing was done by a group of scribes known as J. They started writing the text. Much of J's writings that have been preserved deal with the period of the patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, etc. Very little of J's writings pertain to the Exodus, although there are some pieces of it, and we'll talk about that. When the kingdom divided after Moses, after David, the Davidic dynasty collapsed, and there are two kingdoms: a northern kingdom in Israel and southern kingdom in Judah. We have a group of priests that split off and went to the south, the southern kingdom. They became what we call the e-scribes. And they start writing about 800, 850 BCE. So there's a lot of oral information that they were relying on from generation to generation before they did their writing. In about the year 700 BC, or sometime after 700 BC, when the northern kingdom, was conquered by the Assyrians, the J priests and scribes go to the south, and they maintain their traditions for a period of time. And then was a period of time, sometime after that, where the two themes, J's themes and E themes were combined, and we have what's called a JE text. In that process, some of J's material is filtered out. We similarly have a group of slides that scribes and priests who leave the E group, the Elohim group, and form their own group. Scholars refer to as the P scholar group, or the priestly scribes. And these scribes have their own oral traditions, and they start writing their text about the time just before the Babylonian exile. There's a fourth group of scribes called the D scribes, or the Deuteronomists, who wrote many of the books, the biblical text. And the D scribes, although the scholars are not aware of where they come from, or whether they were part of E or part of P, but much of their work is also very ancient. They start writing during the reign of King Jeremiah King Josiah in the southern kingdom in Judah, or at a time where there was a lot of chaos and a lot of departures from Judaism, that they started formulating their own game plan for bringing Jews back to the Mosaic teachings, writing their texts. At sometime during the Babylonian exile, or prior to returning to Judea, the books are all consolidated, edited, a redaction process takes place, and The assumption is that it was done by Ezra, who is known as a scribe. As a matter of fact, it says that Ezra did it in the book of Nehemiah. So we have a combined text. Did things drop out? Undoubtedly. Things lost on the cutting room floor? No doubt about it. But that's what the text we have now is a result of that process. So we have 4 sources and basically 3 themes. And we'll be talking about that very shortly. Next slide, please. So the combination of the 4 documents result in the story of the Revelation we described last week. Scholars have reconstructed each of the 4 narratives, and we'll start with E. Okay. So E's story is after God proposes a covenant and status as a kingdom of priests, if Israel accepts the covenant and observes his statutes, the people experience this encounter with Moses only through sound, as the mountain was covered in a thick cloud, and the people reached or reacted with terror. So Moses then is instructed by God to build an altar of stones that have been shaped by tools for sacrifices of sheep and oxen. So God should be worshipped at an altar. Okay, as contrasted to the tabernacle, we'll see in another author's story. Moses told the people of God's laws, and they confirmed their acceptance that they enthusiastically endorsed prior to hearing the terms of the covenant. The laws and statutes are orally presented by Moses, and subsequently he writes it down on a scroll. There are no tablets yet. Okay, it's just a scroll. So the picture of Moses or Charlton Heston coming down the mountain with those 2 tablets is not an E story. Okay, he never refers to the Mount Sinai as such, but is referred to as the mountain of God. Moses climbs up the mountain 4 times to hear the proposal, to convey the people's acceptance. After the Decalogue, to receive a group of laws, and each author says there are laws in addition to the 10 commandments, which are referred to as the Decalogue. And then he gets the tablets later on. Okay, the J version. Okay. Appears fragmentary. Obviously, the beginning was left off. It was edited out somewhere in the process. It describes preparations for the theophany, but people are instructed to remain pure, launder their clothing, and they wait for the event to occur. Then Yahweh arrives. They must keep a safe distance. Anybody getting too close to the mountain is instructed. They will be executed, according to J. Yahweh comes down Mount Sinai, he calls Moses at the top of the mountain, and Moses goes up. The people witness fire and smoke and trembling in the mountain, and Yahweh warns Moses again to not let the priests and the people break through, come to see him. They're going to die. Moses makes a lonely ascent back them up the mountain, writes the words on the tablets. Moses writes. What's been preserved of the story, Moses sends the mountain 4 times to report the people's words to the Lord, to warn the people, to prepare for the theophany, to receive the theophany, instructions to warn the people. And then he receives the Decalogue from God that were written on 2 stone tablets by J. So E says no stone tablets, J says stone tablets. Okay, priestly narrative. Israelites arrive at the wilderness of Sinai in the 3rd month after the Exodus. The fire cloud settled on the mountain and covered it for 6 days. And on the 7th day, God calls to Moses, and he went into the cloud. The appearance of God's glory was like a consuming fire, but all the people saw was the fire. Moses was in the mountain for 40 days. according to P. It wasn't a quick journey like P's story. God gave Moses instructions at great length after he entered the cloud for building and furnishing a tabernacle. So he's not getting the 10 Commandments yet. He's getting instructions on building a tabernacle, and the instructions go on page after page. Moses told the actual law giving will commence when the tabernacle has been built. When Moses fulfills the building of the tabernacle, then Moses will get the 10 Commandments, or the commandments and the laws, but it'll be delivered inside the tabernacle. Okay. And Moses descends the mountain with 2 tablets called a testimony of the divine reflection, and his face radiated with from the experience. Okay. Okay, we're talking about the transmission law according to the P source. Okay, there were intermittent meetings with God for receiving the laws and regular assemblies of all Israelites, in which Moses would convey the laws to them. Moses receives the laws, conveys them orally, is not charged with, he did not write them down, nor is it stated that he ever wrote them down. He is given 2 tablets of the testimony that he has to place in the ark, and the ark is in the tabernacle. And there's no reference to the laws as a covenant, or each of the other authors refer to the laws as a covenant, a contract. There's no such law reference in terms of the P source. And in the P source, Moses only ascended the mountain once, and all this was completed in one sitting. Okay. Okay, and it's all completed inside the tabernacle throughout the wilderness journey over a 40-year period of time. The D narrative. This is the Deuteronomic source. Basically follows the E source, and this shouldn't surprise us because we know that the D group was a spinoff from the E groups of priests. And emphasized events took place at a mountain that D calls Horeb. It's not called Sinai. It's not called the mountain of God. D calls the mountain where this occurred Horeb. And D states the Decalogue was declared directly by God. The people begged Moses to receive the laws on their behalf so they will not be consumed by the terrible fire they witnessed. 2 major points are changed in the E narrative. The laws communicated to Moses are not given to the people until 40 years later, at the end of the wilderness journey, when they're about ready to enter Canaan, on the shores of Moab. According to D, that's where the laws and the 10 Commandments were communicated. Then Moses wrote down the entire Torah, according to the Decalogue, just before he died, giving it to the Levites to fulfill. So what we see is the 4 sources disagree on the nature of revelation. P and J portray it as a visual experience. P says the Israelites nations saw the form of God at Sinai, and Adonai's presence was like a consuming fire in the eyes of the Israelites. So it was a visual experience. J says the elders and 4 members of Moses' family saw God. So we read that passage. Moses, Aaron's 2 sons supposedly saw God and celebrated with God. E and D portray the event as just an auditory experience, no visual experience. E says the people experienced thunder and the sound of the horn. The people said to Moses, "You speak with us and we will listen." No visual experience. D says the people did not see God at Horeb. They only heard words while God spoke them inside the fire cloud. So the sources disagree on the timing of the revelation. Yes. In E and D, law giving was an event. Okay. For P, it was a continuous process. It kept going on throughout the 40-year period. So the four sources disagree on whether it was a visual experience, a sound experience, where the revelation occurred, what subsequent events in the wilderness influenced the process, and the biblical narrative of what is reported to have occurred at Sinai really had a profound impact initially for Israel and subsequently for Western civilization. And with these differences, we have some difficulty in terms of understanding the law and its relevance. Next slide. Biblical scholarship tells us how the text was combined. The editor's objective was to create a single continuous teaching, pulling together all four sources. The redactor, who is what we call the editor, elected to treat several existing documents as sacred literature and preserve them maximally, try to use as much as he could with respect to each of the four sources. Because at this point in time, by the time the Jews are in Babylonia, this is 1,000 years since the time, almost not 1,000, 700 years since the time of the Exodus. So he tried to keep as much of it as possible to retain all of the traditions. He used the P version as the framework. So the lengthy tabernacle narrative, by which P, which is by far the largest story, contains most of the corpus of the laws from the text, and everything else was made to fit in around the P narrative. E and J describe an awesome theophany at a mountain. The assumption was they were describing the same events. Therefore, E and J stories got merged. The descent of Adonai Yahweh on the mountain in J was combined with a voice heard from the heavens in E. J's story and E's story of the covenant and law codes were merged into one and inserted at the beginning of P's accounts. So as much as both P and E speak of receiving some object from God on the mountain, P says it's a testimony, E says it's tablets. The author decided to call it tablets. In the combined account, Moses received the instructions for building the tabernacle when he climbed the mountain to receive the tablets, and the source for this was P. Once the tabernacle was built, then the enormous body of P's laws and legislation is fit into the book of Leviticus and appears supplementary to legislation at Sinai, but it's an integral part of the process of revelation. So let's go to the next slide, please. The sources disagree on what the law actually is. He sets forth his understanding in terms of in Exodus 21 through 23. P's are found in the books of Leviticus and Numbers. D's are in the book of Deuteronomy, and J's in the early passages of the book of Exodus. Scholars have noticed how the laws contained in four sources contradict one another, or wouldn't they? And then considerable disagreement exists in the source regarding how it happened, when it happened, what specifically is required to fulfill the covenant, and has created confusion that subsequently was resolved by biblical scholars. Each source uses literary techniques and symbolic language to report how awesome the experience was and its significance to Israel in observing the Decalogue and the supporting legislation. Let's go to the next slide, please. I want to go to the core of the message in terms of the law code, and it's referred to as the holiness code that is contained in the book of Leviticus. But we'll see that there are corresponding passages in other texts. And if anything, what I'm trying to get to is what is the core of the law-giving process. It tells us in terms of in the introduction in Leviticus, the Lord spoke to Moses saying, speak to the Israelite people and say to them, I am Yahweh your God. You shall not copy the practices of the land of Egypt where you dwelt, or the land of Canaan where I'm taking you. My rules alone shall you observe and faithfully follow my laws. I, Adonai, Yahweh, am your God. So I asked the question, how would the tribes that did not experience the Exodus from Egypt react to these laws? Remember, this is only one tribe that is coming out of Egypt. They have to buy into it. And they buy into an extended period of time. Goes on, the holiness goes on to say, you shall be holy, for I, the Lord, your God, am holy. What does it mean to be holy? Can we open this up so people can talk? What's your sense in terms of what it means to be holy?
You can raise your hand or unmute yourself and
And let's keep everybody unmuted at this point. Because
okay.
Okay.
Sure. Well,
Anybody want to?
It's being set apart from others.
Being set apart from others. Good. For what purpose, Bob?
Purpose being to capture the essence of Yahweh and share it with everyone else religiously. I didn't word that very often, but
Very good. Good, Bob. And so it's a willingness to be different, a willingness to not necessarily conform to the way others in the environment behave, but to follow a specific set of instructions, the code. So Leviticus says, when you reap your harvest, you shall not reap all the way to the edges of your field or gather the gleanings of your harvest. You shall reserve them for the poor and the stranger. What's the point of this? The point is, taking care of the poor is not a matter of generosity or benevolence of the landowner. The text is telling us it's an obligation to care for others in need. It is a statement that the disadvantaged have a right to support from society. We call that social justice. If there is a dominant theme that will surface in the biblical, throughout the biblical text, and it is this concept, this concern for others in terms of social justice. The Holiness Code goes on to say, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. I'm sure you have heard this before in many different sections. This is the origin of it. It is one of the most famous lines in the biblical text. It's repeated in the New Testament. Leviticus says, when a stranger resides in your land, you shall not wrong him. He shall be as one of your own citizens. You shall love him as yourself, for you were strangers in the land of Egypt. I, the Lord, am your God. What a remarkable proposition. Coming out of ancient Israel, which was embedded in the Near East region of wars, slavery, class distinction, tribalism, ethnic division, social injustice, discrimination of all kinds, and hatred of the other. And the text is telling us, dump it. Hey, forget what was done to you. Do unto others. So Leviticus 19:33 through 34. Let me read it because it's rather profound, and I want to make sure we get it. When a stranger resides with you in your land, you shall not wrong him. The stranger who resides with you shall be to you as one of your citizens. You shall love him as yourself, for you were strangers in the land of Egypt. I, the Lord, am your God. What does this have to say about the impact of the Egyptian experience? Nowhere in ancient literature Is there a concern for the feelings of the stranger which the Torah imposes? The memory of being aliens in Egypt left a lasting memory amongst Israelites, a memory not to replicate that kind of a society. And we'll see it repeated, not just in the book of Leviticus, but by the writings of the priests, but in also the E codes and the D codes. Aliens in Israel had equal rights under the law and were forbidden from practices that would defile society. There are 36 citations in the Torah to protect the interests of strangers and their relationship with Israelites, regarding them as neighbors. Next slide, please. Now, the first two references are from the E code. This is the E author writing. Exodus 12:49. There shall be one law for the citizen and the stranger that dwells among you. So obviously P picked up on that and bought into it. Exodus 22, E writing again. You shall not persecute an alien, and you shall not oppress him, because you were aliens in the land of Egypt. You know the soul of the stranger. Deuteronomy 24. This is the D code, D source. You shall not subvert the rights of the stranger or the fatherless. Remember, you were a slave in Egypt, and the Lord your God redeemed you from there. The Egyptian experience had a profound impact on the development of the biblical text. The authors of E, P, and D were equally concerned about it. They tell us the divine will is to love the other, the stranger. The command is you must love the stranger, the other, the alien. Is described over and over. It's unique to Torah in ancient literature. It suggests aliens had a difficult time finding acceptance in the Near East and throughout the world. Torah gives us two explicit reasons. You know the feelings of the stranger, having yourself been a stranger in Egypt. You were mistreated in Egypt. Therefore, do not do to others what was done to your forefathers. Seems to me that may be an important theme to introduce to our Passover service. As we talk about freedom, we talk about the responsibility of operating in a free world where we are concerned with the other. Today, aliens, strangers continue to have difficult experiences integrating into a majority culture that tends to be hostile to people with different orientations. So open questions. What is a stranger? When we meet, what do we mean when we label someone a stranger or an alien? I need help. Anyone want to answer that?
A stranger could be somebody that lives in your land, but you don't know them. An alien would be somebody from another country.
Okay, an alien from another country, good. And a stranger might be somebody with a different skin color than yours or different ethnic background. Okay. Why does the dominant group within a culture feel superior to or threatened by groups we label strangers? Anyone? We feel threatened by someone who is not like us.
They will take over.
Okay, they might take over. Threaten us, good. What kind of society do the authors of Torah envision by creating laws that protect the stranger or an alien? What kind of society?
A welcoming society that welcomes
Good.
everyone.
Absolutely. A welcoming society, egalitarian, everybody is equal. What does the emphasis of laws and teachings in Torah establish equality and fairness in the relationship with the native and the stranger suggest about the reality of the experience in Egypt?
Hello? Bye.
And I suggest to you that experience of being a stranger and how strangers were taught, were treated in the Egyptian culture, created an environment where these Levites, these former Egyptian slaves, concluded that's not the kind of world that they want to live in. They were trying to create a different kind of world. Next slide, please. So what is the most important of all biblical laws? Love the stranger as yourself. It's the foundation for creating pluralism in society. All the rest of Torah is commentary. The challenge is, can we see the humanity of someone who is not like us? Next slide, please. So modern biblical scholarship on the biblical laws teaches that economic, social, judicial, religious, and other aspects of the laws contained in the books of Exodus, Leviticus, and Deuteronomy do not necessarily reflect a nomadic or semi-nomadic society, that they came later. They reflect the conditions of a settled civilization and some degree of well-being. It also suggests that the origination of many of the laws belong to a time of Israel's settlement in Canaan. They were already there. So the question is, why attribute this body of laws to a revelation that occurred at Sinai or Horeb or the mountain of God, depending on how it's described? Why are they, if they originated at a later date? Any thoughts? If we're dealing with a situation in the land during 400 or 500 years after the Exodus experience, and we're trying to create remedies for those situations, why attribute them to the time of the Exodus?
It would give it more authority.
Okay, good. So it would give it more authority. I agree with that. I would suggest to you that what the biblical authors recognized or came to believe is that at the time of the Exodus, at the time of the experience in the wilderness, whether it be Sinai or the mountain of God, wherever it is, that the closeness to God evolved from that point in time, that God was closer with them than at any other point in time. And so they expanded that experience to subsequent events. It also suggests that at the time each source developed its narrative or the revelation, there was a wide variation in the remembered history. But one thing that was a constant was that there was a revelation, or that a revelation occurred that Moses had experienced. And they weren't going to carry that forward into their continued existence. Next slide. So we have 4 different accounts of the revelation. The experience was overwhelming that occurred in Sinai. The way people perceive what happened varied. The way people describe what occurred and transmitted to succeeding generations also varied. There were various transitions that existed. There were divergent memories that were based on oral referrals that were preserved by the 4 sources. Each of the sources were written centuries after the events occurred, based on the oral tradition. There would have to be differences in understanding on what happened at Sinai that grew during centuries of that oral transmission. And that's what's been preserved. The 4 different accounts of Revelation provided historical memories of what was perceived by the 4 sources, and the redactor simply consolidated them. But the prophet Hosea refers to that in terms of the 9th century, who wrote in the 9th century BCE, describes the legal case that the Lord has against Israel for violating it. So what's clear certainly by the 9th century BCE is there was a general understanding of what the covenant existed as evidence of the antiquity of the covenant. All four sources agree that the Covenant of Sinai was about God's self-disclosure of God's will. It created an emotional connection between humanity and the divine. Humanity was being commanded to create a more just and ethical society as the central focus of their relationship with God, and that evolved and came out of Sinai. So why then did Ezra, the redactor, preserve multiple points of view regarding how it happened, where it happened, and most of all, what are the laws? Ezra realized that there's more than one way to fulfill the covenant with God, to serve God. I think it's a vital teaching for our own time when there is so much divisiveness within our society that different interpretations are okay. Immorality, it's the significance of Sinai, as I said, it was a morality code, evolved, that was represented as a prophetic revelation based upon the expression of the will of God. The revelation occurred not to a selected prophet alone or to a privileged class of priests, but to a whole people. They in turn became answerable, accountable for the terms of the covenant, to abide by commandments and laws that guide human behavior and morality. The people that became Israel gave their assent to the Torah, the teaching, the instruction, making God's law their own. Sinai meant that Israel came to know both the existence of the living God and demands made by that God from Israel first, and then for all of humanity. Personal freedom gained from the Exodus and from Egypt also requires collective responsibility to achieve a society rooted in justice for all. What was the revelation at Sinai or Horeb or wherever it occurred? It was the moment of time when people who ultimately became Israel made a covenant to create a society based upon the rule of law, of an ethical and moral code of laws, a society where all people are equal in the eyes of law as they are equal in the eyes of their God. This is a good place to stop, and we'll open it up to any questions that you have. Let's go back. Okay. So I'm open now for any questions or comments or discussion that you'd like to have relative to this process, this document that we call the 10 Commandments.
Bob Cohn,
Recognizing the 10 Commandments are more than just 10 Commandments, but a series of laws made to fulfill those commandments. Okay.
Bob Cohn.
Yes, very interesting talk as usual. And I think it's interesting to compare the different texts, the different takes on ancient Israelite history, the Jewish history, with the history of the United States, which is being contested by more recent historian, the 1619 Project versus the traditional histories that most of us in our 70s and 80s grew up with, and the effort to kind of reconcile them, which has not yet taken place. But we also in the New Testament class taught by Rabbi Shook, that where they have these different interpretations, and an effort is made to kind of have a unified approach to it by tying together various strands that see things differently into a coherent narrative.
Yeah, I think that's points well taken. I think what's important to recognize in terms of that the text, that there are different narratives that were blended together in the text that make it difficult to read, confusing, contradictory, but yet there's a core theme that each of the writers in their own way subscribe to in terms of what is critical for creating a just society, a society that's different from the kind of society that was experienced in Egypt or throughout the Middle East. And that I think is what is really the core to the understanding. Other comments or points? Any questions?
You can raise your hand, you can unmute yourself and ask your question, type something in the chat. Bob Becker, did you have something? I'm not seeing anything. Oh,
Yeah.
Alan, I
Yeah.
think Alan and then
Yes.
Harvey.
Hello, Alan.
Hi, how are you?
Haven't
Sheldon?
seen you in a while.
Oh, well, I always want to come and listen to you and just get re-stimulated. So I appreciate that. I have a question. Just the general notion, as the scholars have reinterpreted how the Bible was written, it obvious to me weakens the notion that it was written by God. And I just wondered, in terms of how long it's going to be around and has been around, I think because it, quote, was assumed to have been written by God, was very powerful in terms of having it last for thousands of years. Now that we're going to change our view and say it's, it's as you described, does that make it more of a piece of literature than a word of God? And as such, would that make it more difficult to last for another 2,000 years in the same way?
Well, yeah, good question. And that is something that scholars at different conferences have debated, particularly within the Orthodox community. And the challenge in terms of question is, does looking at the current scholarship and concluding that different authors had different understandings, does that delude from the ability to keep people focused in terms of what's really important in terms of our tradition? And there are different points of view. Most scholars take the point, well, if people have the intellect to understand enough that the text is confusing, it's complicated, inconsistent, are they just going to walk away from it and do nothing? Or if they understand the process by which it was put together and that there is a core that everybody agrees to, are we better off? It's kind of like the idea that the world is flat. Okay, we keep telling people the world is flat, and somebody comes up with the idea that no, it's not. It's round, and the world is the sun is not supplementary to the earth. The earth is supplementary to the sun. We will go around the sun. Okay, that's not that the sun goes around Earth. Well, the first time people heard that, they put the author in jail. Okay, but we learned that the truth is that we can accept the truth. I think if you keep telling people that the world, the sun revolves around the world of the earth, you're going to turn people off intellectually. Whereas if people understand the reality of how the text was put together and what the thinking was, I think it's a much better opportunity to people buying in rather than acceptance by blind faith. Blind faith in a text that could not occur. Okay, could not have occurred that way. So what do we do with it intellectually? We reject it. But if you look at it, I think as allegory, and recognize that ancient people told their stories through myths. But in each myth, there is truth, a historical event that occurred. But it's just the way the text tells the story. Last week, I talked about the coincidence of recognizing in Egypt the story of the sea people. The Egyptians were at war, the sea people with the sea people. who became known as the Philistines. And that's how we can, it occurred in the 8th year of Pharaoh Ramesses III. And we know from the biblical text that the sea people, the Philistines, were at war with Egypt, according to the biblical text, at the time of the Exodus. So we can place the time frame. Well, those sea people, they had their own story. They lost a war in Troy to the Mycenaeans, and the sea people, who were known in Greece as the Minoans, became the Philistines and became the sea people. And then from there, they went to Carthage, and then from Carthage, they founded Rome. They have their own story. It's called the Aeneid. It's a book that a lot of people have read in English literature. It's just the way ancients told their story. Did it happen exactly the way it occurred? Obviously not. That's not how myths work. But there is history behind the story. And that's what I think in terms of we need to recognize if we use the text in a sound way. And that's really the foundation of modern biblical scholarship, is recognizing that the story we've all learned and fallen in love with is myth, but there is some history to it.
So
Thanks, Al.
Sheldon, the lady on the Galaxy tab, she has a comment in the chat. She comments, it was difficult for the people to give up free will, and bias also got in the way.
Also, what got in the way?
A bias, I'm sorry, the lady on Galaxy, do you want to unmute yourself and explain your question or your comment?
Yeah, I think that discipline takes a long time, and it's exactly what's going on right now in the world. No one wants to be disciplined, and so and many times we all think that we are right and the other people should conform to what we say and how we think. And I think that it hasn't changed. It was that way then, and it still is like that.
Yeah, I understand what you're saying. I think that what the teaching is, freedom is great. Freedom is important. But we need to be concerned with social justice. We need to abide by a certain set of rules so that everyone can enjoy freedom.
And that's discipline.
And that's discipline.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Just think about how we have handled the COVID crisis. Right.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Are we concerned about others? Do we concern about others? Okay. Can we really enjoy freedom and still be reckless? Your points are well taken. It's difficult, but that's why the text is there to tell us that there's a better way of doing things. Okay. Mm-hmm. Don't replicate Egypt.
Harvey Gerstein, did you have something that you wanted to ask or say? You'll have to unmute. And then Mr. Silber.
Okay.
Harvey, you need to unmute?
I was just going to say, Sheldon, the priest didn't agree with that. The priest thought they were holier than anyone.
Well, like a lot of a lot of societies, after a period of time, that injustices emerged. Okay, the priests were imperfect. Okay, and we see that in all walks of life. That it's sometimes very difficult to walk the talk.
So, Mr. Silber had his hand up. Do you want to unmute yourself?
All right, can you hear? Yeah, yeah. Okay, with history right now, what I'd say was Putin. I'm sure he's Russian Orthodox, and the laws of Russian Orthodox kind of goes hand in hand with the scriptures, and he is not following them at all. Every person is different, so he's trying to extricate his other people.
Okay, I don't know Putin that well, and you probably don't either.
Yeah, right.
But Putin grew up and emerged and spent most of his career, professional career, as a communist. Okay. Religion in Russia was forbidden, whether it was the Russian Orthodox Church or any church. And in order to practice religion in Russia prior to 1991, you have to participate in an underground movement. There were underground churches in Russia, not many, but it wasn't until after the Soviet Union broke up, the communist era was over, that churches were reestablished. Okay, so let's forgive Putin for not understanding Christianity. Okay, not for nothing else. Okay, I doubt that there is anything in terms of religious education in Putin's background.
Well, if we have some more questions, comments, we're getting close. We're running out of time. So, yes, did Mr. Frankel, do you have? No, that was a clap. Yeah.
Sheldon, just maybe I misunderstood, but I didn't hear you dispute that something happened at Sinai, just that there were 4 different periods of time and different authors that wrote about what may have happened at Sinai and had slightly different takes on what happened at Sinai.
Yes, it's slightly different takes, and they were expanded. I'm not saying that at Sinai or wherever it was in the wilderness, that something didn't occur.
There are people that say that Sinai didn't occur.
Right. I think there's enough material to suggest something happened in the wilderness. And as I said last week, Revelation does not necessarily consist of the words. It's not something that is spoken. If we read the words and think, and that's the revelation, that we don't understand Revelation. Revelation is an experience that one has and tries to reduce to words. Okay, so I believe there was a revelation in that sense. Okay, that got communicated over and over again. Okay, and reinterpreted.
Somewhat like the telephone game, then.
Something like that, only it took place for many more years.
All right. Well, thank you so much today, Sheldon, with so much information. We really appreciate it. It's a lot to think about.
Well, thank you for
we
coming.
really thank you very, very much. Thank you everyone for participating today. And we know you have some more thoughts on these kinds of things, and maybe in the future we'll have another program. So thank you.
Thank you all for coming, and Judy, thank you for your assistance.
You're welcome. Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye. Have a good afternoon.